Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to an all-new episode of the Word of the Day podcast, where useful words are pleasantly explained. And unlike some shows out there, whether podcast or television or others, that I presume must release only partially new or perhaps entirely old episodes sometimes, otherwise they wouldn't feel the need to clarify when a given episode is in fact all new, we here at the Word of the Day podcast deal solely in fresh, original material every single show. My name is Jamie Silva, your host, and it is time to pleasantly explain another useful word. Today's word is the noun wherewithal, which I would define as the means or resources required to do or accomplish something. So if I wanted to, say, split some firewood for my campfire, but I lacked an axe, a hatchet, or a saw, then I wouldn't have the necessary tools to make kindling, and thus I would lack the wherewithal to make a fire. If you were to Google the definition of wherewithal, here's what you would see. Quote, the money or other means needed for a particular purpose. Unquote. Well, I wouldn't have made money the primary focus, but that does make sense. Like, money is a type of resource, and probably the best type, actually, because you can use it to buy other resources. Now, wherewithal is one of a large family of words that are composed of two or three much smaller words. Ones like therefore, wherefore, and heretofore, herein, wherein, and therein, nonetheless, therewith/herewith, inasmuch, insofar, hereabouts and thereabouts, henceforth and thenceforth, and so on. Some of these are pretty fancy or archaic, and probably a little bit too flowery to toss around these days, while others, like therefore and nonetheless, are actually pretty common. Now, I realize that wherewithal doesn't seem to fit this pattern, because only that first syllable, where, is clearly a word. The latter portion, withal, certainly doesn't look like a word, but actually it is. In rather Old English, withal was a mashing together of with and all, and it basically meant with this, or with which. So you could say, Mike took out his credit card and paid for the tapas withal, which just meant Mike paid for the tapas with his credit card. Another example might be, Evelyn stared at her broken blender withal she had made so many delicious smoothies in days gone by. So, wherewithal, when you think about it, might help answer the question, where will you find the means withal to do something? By way of example, if you have the wherewithal to make a pillow fort, that means you have plenty of pillows and blankets withal to make a pillow fort. This interpretation might be a little bit of a stretch on my part, but I think it basically works, and if it helps you remember how to use wherewithal, then I'm going to chalk that up as a victory. I should note as well that there is one other meaning of withal that's like in addition to or on top of all that. Thus, you might say, the alligator had sharp teeth, a fearsome tail, and a short temper withal. But this is all academic, because you shouldn't use either sense of withal today. This word has long since been laid to rest, and although I do have a certain fondness for it, resurrecting it would be a losing effort. So instead, let's talk about usage for wherewithal. Interestingly, people almost exclusively use wherewithal when they want to say that they do not have the wherewithal to do something. They are unable to get whatever it is done because they lack the money or other resources. Very seldom would you see the flip side of this, where someone says, happily, I have the wherewithal to accomplish such and such a task. This is sort of like how people will say, I haven't got a clue, to indicate that they don't have the slightest idea about something. But there is almost no situation in which someone would say, like, hey, I have a clue, to indicate that they might have at least some information or some slight awareness of what's going on. In my mind, wherewithal is a great word because it allows you to explain why you aren't doing things in a way that absolves you of blame. Like, you would have taken down the Christmas lights before May, but you couldn't find the ladder, so you simply did not have the wherewithal to reach them. Really, this is the ladder's fault, if you think about it. This usage is especially appropriate for the office, where it is essential to blame a stingy budget or having too much on your plate for why you didn't get your work done. All right, let's get some examples of wherewithal in ordinary conversation or writing. Example number 1. Since she lacked the wherewithal to pay for the newest iPhone, Molly suffered the shame of carrying around an old and inferior model. Example number 2. Sorry, that report you asked for may be delayed, said Trevor to his boss. I'm afraid I just didn't have the wherewithal to compile the relevant sales figures. I've just been slammed this whole month. But if I could hire an intern, perhaps? Example number 3. Grant knew that if he only possessed the wherewithal to start his own gym with an in-house cupcake shop under the name Cupcakewalk, he would be independently wealthy in no time. But sadly, the loan officers did not share his optimism. Example number 4 comes from the book Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Quote, "At the inn, as I entered, I looked about me with so black a countenance as to make the attendants tremble. Not a look did they exchange in my presence, but meekly took my orders, led me to a private room, and brought me the wherewithal to write." Unquote. Presumably, the wherewithal to write would be like a pen and paper and maybe an ink blotter. Example number 5 is from the short story Uneasy Money by P.G. Wodehouse. Quote, "It was ridiculous to be telling hard luck stories about not being able to buy a farm when he had the wherewithal to buy dozens of farms." Unquote. Alrighty then, with today's word complete, I would like to feature another edition of one of my favorite segments, Sayings No One Says, in which we look at stuff people say and ask why, and also stuff they don't say and ask why not. Today, I want to talk about a phrase one often sees in books set in olden times, those with monarchs and courtiers and noblemen and dukes and such, all hanging about the royal court. And it seems to me that invariably in these settings, if you wanted to address the king or queen, you had to use the phrase, "May it please your highness." It really didn't matter who you were. All requests, announcements, observations, and basic statements apparently had to start or perhaps end with that phrase. Some examples might be, "May it please your highness, a message has just arrived from the general of your army in the west." Or perhaps, "I have a proposal for a new moat, one that involves spikes, crocodiles, and crocodiles carrying spikes. May it please your highness." So what I find odd about this phrase is that you only ever hear that one version, "May it please your highness." And I wonder, what if you were hoping that his or her highness would feel some emotion other than pleasure in response to whatever you were saying? Consider these very viable alternatives. Number 1. Here's a birthday cake. May it surprise your highness. Number 2. May it shock and dismay your highness. The barbarians are battering down the city gates as we speak. And number 3. Hey, here's a gross bug I found. May it weird out your highness. Sadly, in all the novels about royalty that I read growing up, no earl or courtier or suppliant had the courage or the creativity to switch up that conventional form. I suppose the possibility of banishment or beheading if the ruler is not amused by your contribution tends to encourage a certain amount of conformity. Okay then, having covered that non-existent saying, I want to alert you all to the fact that our next show will be a 50th episode extravaganza, featuring more or less the same sort of stuff as a typical show, but you'll just have to savor it. Because afterwards, we will take a couple of weeks off for relaxation purposes. If this hiatus is super traumatic for you, it's really tough to take, what with the absence of anyone in your life pleasantly explaining useful words to you, might we encourage you to go back through some of our archives, which are all available on iTunes, and listen to some of the fantastic words we've featured this year. Words like umbrage, impecunious, and wallmate, or perhaps mendacious, misanthropic, and countenance. And while you're there on iTunes downloading old episodes, perhaps just take a couple seconds to rate the show and drop us a quick review. We don't really get anything out of it except a quick case of the warm fuzzies, but we're still very grateful. Now, it is the custom, I believe, especially near the end of a season, for podcast hosts to encourage more reviews by reading from and thanking a couple of the people who have already left reviews. So that's what I'd like to do now. Here we go. Username Conman90 says, "Fun words, easy to digest, easy to remember." Well, thank you so much, Conman90. I'm not sure what you're trying to manipulate me into with that review, but thanks anyway. Next, username Rainbows Are My Hobbies writes, "Love it. I love the music, especially the outro music. Oh, hey, wow, guys, a band shout out. Are you hearing this? You're getting noticed. Like, this could be your big break. Better look sharp at the end of this episode, okay?" Continuing with the review. I love how straight to the point the podcast is. The host's dry humor keeps you on your toes, which I also love. Well, Rainbows Are My Hobbies, you have that right. All the humor on this show is carefully salted, cured, and smoked over a period of many weeks so as to ensure peak dryness and unbeatable flavor, because we want it to age well. So, again, thank you so much for your review. Lastly, let's do one more here. Let's see. Okay, so this one comes from the username Me the Host, and it reads, quote, "I, for one, like this podcast. That's why I created it. If I did not like the show, I would delete it straight away, unquote. Oh, right, that's the iTunes review that I wrote. Regardless, in keeping with the theme of gratitude here, I would like to thank me for being such a fan of the show, and I'll be sure to send myself some complimentary merchandise as a reward. For now, though, this is Jamie Silva, aka me, aka the host, saying so long from the RAV4 studios. This has been another all-new episode of the... Well, it isn't technically new anymore if you're almost done listening to it already. This is all so confusing. At any rate, you've been listening to the Word of the Day podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.